Hello, friends. My name is Randy Blanton. I am one of the pastors at Aldersgate in Shelby, North Carolina, and I am here to talk about Proclamation for Provisional Candidates. First of all, thank you for hearing and answering God's call on your life. Second, if you would like the notes from this presentation, I can be found at rblanton@wnccumc.net. So first, plan and prepare. This applies to every sermon, but especially anything that you are submitting for the board. A good rule of thumb is 1 hour of preparation for 1 minute in the pulpit. Don't wait until the last minute to record your sermon. There's always a possibility of technical or audio glitches, so you don't want to find yourself in a bind. Read and follow the instructions. Preach a sermon that falls within the dates assigned by the Board of Ordained Ministry. Show evidence that you have incorporated other folks into the planning of your worship service. Practice. 2 reasons for this. One, in practicing, and especially if you record yourself, you will see things that you may not realize about your delivery. Years ago, I took the Institute of Preaching. We recorded ourselves, and when I watched that first video, I was mortified. I realized that I had turned to a preaching style that was way too fast, way too monotone, so I had to make some adjustments. Second of all, practicing, especially with the technology, again, reduces the risk of a glitch. What's the best sermon model? There is no best sermon model. Even if you don't preach with a manuscript, you will need to submit a transcript of your sermon. Original material. We want to see and hear you. Nothing wrong with quoting someone, nothing wrong with using someone else's illustration, but don't let that stuff be the bulk of your sermon. We want to hear you. Remember, this will go through Authenticate, so please cite your sources. United Methodist and Wesleyan theology. It doesn't have to be a doctrinal sermon, but we do want to see evidence of both of those in your sermon. Remember your audience. You're not preaching in a seminary chapel. You're not preaching to classmates in your preaching lab. Probably you're not even preaching to colleagues. You're going to be preaching to a lot of folks who have little or no theological training. And the Whom Shall I Send document says this: understands context and community. Jesus spoke in the language of his hearers. He spoke to farmers. He spoke to folks working in the household. He spoke to folks who knew the religious law. He spoke in their language. Be yourself. I know you're still finding your preaching voice 24 years in. I'm still finding my preaching voice, but be yourself. God has called you. Again, quoting from the Whom Shall I Send document, it says in part, quote, serves out of a conscious and obvious relationship with Jesus Christ and a set-apart call to ministry. God called you. Be your authentic self. Be relatable. Again, this is tied back to preach to your audience and know your audience. The best theological discourse is useless if it's not relatable to your audience and if they don't understand it. An illustration goes a long way. But again, don't use illustrations as a way of avoiding exegeting the Scripture. Scripture is primary. The sermon should be rooted in Scripture. Now that sounds obvious, but it's very easy for us to preach our pet peeves and really never delve deeply into the Scripture. The other thing about Scripture being primary is stick to the Scripture. Last year I heard a wonderful sermon from a well-renowned theologian and preacher. And the problem was this: she read a passage of text, she took one single word from that scripture, and then she went off on this tangent and preached a wonderful sermon, but it had nothing to do with the scripture text she'd actually read to begin her sermon. So stick with your text. See the world through theological eyes. Now, I don't want you to go around constantly thinking about your sermon. We all need a break. But if you're seeing the world through theological eyes, there's a good chance that illustrations are going to be popping up all around you from your life. You won't need to go and find other people's illustrations. They'll be all around you. And of course, the earlier you start in your preparation, the more likely those illustrations will pop up in ways that you can see them. And of course, everything that you see, every theological connection you make in the world around you may not make it into this week's sermon. Stick it in a file. You may use it a month or a year down the road. So again, if you want any of the notes from this presentation, you can find me at rblanton@wnccumc.net. Friends, thank you very much, and God bless.